Hi everybody, this is lecture 1. We're going to talk in this lecture about cultural anthropology and really what it is, what the key concepts are, what some of the sort of tools and methods are that cultural anthropologists use, and hopefully give you a better sense of what this discipline is so that as we move across the semester, you know what that sort of fundamental set of ideas are and you can apply them throughout. Cultural anthropology is sometimes described as making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. What we mean by this is by engaging in the kind of work that cultural anthropologists do, it allows us to understand cultural worlds that we're not familiar with as part of our shared humanity. That is to say that all people everywhere share certain characteristics, right? We're all human. We engage in a lot of the same kinds of activities, even if we do so from different cultural perspectives. So making the strange familiar means that using the tools of cultural anthropology, you can start to engage with unfamiliar cultural worlds or cultures that are not yours or that you've never sort of participated in before, and understand sort of that those are examples of the human experience, not that different than your own. On the other hand, it also makes it familiar strange. And what that means is that cultural anthropology allows us to sort of step back from all the things that we take for granted in our own cultural worlds and understand them as just one variation among many. So you'll both get a new perspective on the way you do things and new appreciation for the ways that other people do things. So that is, I think, sort of the premise for a lot of the stuff that we're going to be doing in the course this semester. All right, before we dig too much further into cultural anthropology, I want to put this in the context of the broader field of anthropology. Anthropology is broader than just cultural anthropology. It's a field that actually includes 4 branches, or what are sometimes called subfields. And the idea with having these different sort of parts of the discipline is that each one takes a somewhat different approach to studying humans and what it means to be human. And that if you look at all those different approaches together, you get a much more well-rounded or holistic view of the human experience, okay? So let me just give you that sort of snapshot of what these 4 branches or subfields of anthropology are before we zoom in and focus on cultural anthropology, which is what this particular course is about, okay? So the overall sort of definition of what anthropology is that I'm going to use here is that it's the study of what it means to be human across space and over time. That's just a one-sentence definition, so obviously we could go into much more detail and sort of debate all the terms I've used here, but I think it's a good sort of very condensed summary, right? So what it means to be human, but also looking cross-culturally at what it means to be human, that's the across space piece, right? Not only what it means to be human or how people live their lives, envision their worlds, you know, here in Chicago, but all over the world and also across time, right? So going way back in time in terms of thinking about human evolution, but also thinking historically, right? The ways that people lived their lives and ate and dressed and married and all those other things, even 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, obviously much different than right now. So the study of what it means to be human across space and over time. Then we've got our 4 sort of subfields or branches of anthropology that are all trying to contribute to understanding that, right, what it means to be human. Biological anthropology, as the name suggests, is interested in what it means to be human biologically. So, for example, studying human evolution, right, but also studying human biological variation, meaning not only sort of across time, but in the present. What are the sort of physical variations that we see across different populations of people? We know that people are not all identical to one another. We're all part of the same species and we have a lot in common, but there are those variations. So biological anthropologists are interested in understanding that and how they reflect the evolution of the human species. Archaeology is in some ways quite similar to cultural anthropology. Archaeologists are interested in culture, interested in human societies, but the difference is that archaeologists study human societies of the past. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with this. Either you've seen, Indiana Jones or something else. There's some famous sort of fictional archaeologists out there. So because they're studying societies of the past, archaeologists need to rely on what those societies left behind, right? So that is things like the remnants of their houses or pieces of the pottery that they used to store water or store food, right? Not everything is going to survive. So archaeologists excavate or dig up those remnants and try to use that stuff that's left over, that remains, to piece together what those societies of the past were like. The third subfield is linguistic anthropology, and again, as the name suggests, this is a focus on language and cultural context. Language, as we'll talk about a little bit later in the course, is one of the hallmarks of what it means to be human, right? So linguistic anthropologists really sort of focus on that, focus on human communication, and that includes both the nature of language, how languages are structured, and also how people use language in different sorts of contexts to communicate. And then finally, last but not least, of course, is cultural anthropology, which I'm defining here as the study of contemporary human social life, all right? This is the subfield that we'll focus on in this class, Anthropology 212, but I think it's worth understanding that there's a bigger picture into which cultural anthropology fits, right? In here, we'll be focusing on contemporary people, so living people, as they live in cultural groups, and what the sort of ins and outs of those shared lives, those shared worldviews are. So that is our subject for this semester. Okay. So let me talk a little bit then about the most important concept that we need to take on board to understand the work of cultural anthropologists, and that is culture. Culture is a topic that obviously is central to what anthropologists do. It's also a concept that has been debated quite a bit by cultural anthropologists. It's an important but not always a straightforward or easy to understand concept. Anthropologists themselves have often debated what culture is and what the value of the culture concept is. So I'm going to start by giving you sort of, I think, what are some fundamental characteristics of this concept, but understand that, again, it's something that we'll also sort of learn about and which will emerge over the course of the semester, particularly as you read the work of anthropologists. So again, for the sake of sort of giving you a quick entry into understanding this concept, I'm going to give you a very short definition of what culture is. So what I'm saying here is that culture is everything that people do, feel, think, and say in the context of a particular social world. There are a few things to look at in that definition. The first is that I'm saying that it's what people do, feel, think, and say, all right? So in other words, culture operates sort of in various realms or at various levels. So it's certainly observable things like what people do, right? How people greet one another, what kind of gestures they use, how far or close together they sit when they get on a bus. But it's also some more sort of internal or subjective things that are a little bit harder to observe, but are still really important, right? How people think about or conceptualize things, right? How people think that the world is organized. Do people think that there's a supernatural world or a world that is beyond and maybe invisible to humans here in this sort of everyday life? Those are sort of conceptual parts of what culture is that are also important, but often sort of live inside of people's heads to some extent, which again, we'll talk more about how anthropologists sort of access that information. It's also about how people express themselves, right? Or represent things through, as I say here, what they say, right? So that's not only about people's use of language per se, but it's also about sort of how articulating things out loud is one piece of culture, but it's not everything, right? I'm sure you've all had the experience of sort of thinking one thing and saying something different for all kinds of reasons. Well, that's part of, culture too, and it's certainly something cultural anthropologists need to deal with. So culture then I'm defining as everything people do, feel, think, and say in the context of a particular social world. So that's the second part that's really important to look at. So what I'm saying is culture is a universal, right? All humans are cultural beings, and all people are engaging in this thing called culture that has to do with both feeling and thinking things and doing and saying things. But it's also extraordinarily variable. So when we study culture, we're not just going to study culture in general. We're going to study culture as it manifests in a particular social world, right? So those things that people do, feel, think, and say are not the same everywhere, right? So this is a sort of key component of what anthropologists think about when we think about what culture is and when we try to understand culture in a particular place and time, all right? I put a couple of quotes on the slide as well, which I think do a good job of sort of encapsulating this idea that is embedded in the definition. So the first one is by an anthropologist named Reich. And he says, quote, "To be human is to be simultaneously the recipient of millions of years of culture and to be active as a creator of culture." What I want you to take from this is that culture is simultaneously something that has continuity and something that is passed from one generation to the next. So in other words, you don't, wake up in the morning and create culture anew. You are living in a context, in a set of ideas, in a set of practices that you were introduced to by the people that came before you, by your family, by your ancestors, etc. Right? So you are, to a certain extent, bearing forward something that you inherited, right? Again, from your family, from your community, from your society. However, it's really important to point out that that doesn't mean that you are somehow like a cultural robot, just reproducing exactly what every generation before you did. The fact is you inherit or you bear forward those cultural practices and concepts that you get from your parents and others. But you also have free will and autonomy and innovation and creativity. So you also change that culture as you bear it forward, right? People don't just reproduce culture in exactly the same form. People sometimes resist the cultural lessons they were taught by their parents and their grandparents. Or they come up with entirely new things, right? So culture is changing constantly before our eyes. It's always in flux, even as it also is something that ties us to the past and connects generations together. Another way of sort of articulating that is the quote I have on the bottom, which I somehow left the name off. The anthropologist who said this is named Spradley. And what he said is that cultural knowledge is not a list of rules, but, quote, a set of principles for map making and navigation. So again, same idea. Culture doesn't limit you or sort of put a straitjacket on you that you have to do things a certain way. It provides a sort of blueprint, right, or a set of guidelines. And the fact is then, when you take up those tools or those ideas, you create something that may be a different variation on those practices that has never been seen before, right? So you're not just following the map, right, as it's laid out, you're also making a map for future generations. So let me now break down more specifically some of the key qualities of this concept of culture that I've now defined. The first characteristic of culture I want to talk about is the fact that it's learned. Unlike other animals, most other animals at least, there is some debate about whether, for example, the great apes have something that we can call culture. But for the most part, unlike other animals, Humans are not born with instincts that guide how they do things in the world, right? You are not born already knowing what you need to do to survive and thrive. Those things are taught to you, again, typically by parents or guardians, family members, community members, the people that are around you the most as you're growing up. Again, we're unlike other kinds of creatures on this planet in the degree to which both as babies and children, we are dependent on our parents and other caretakers, and also on the degree to which those guidelines for living are passed from those older people to younger people. You don't know inherently how to do things, you are taught. So culture is learned. Culture is also shared. So by definition, we're talking about a social phenomenon. You're not a culture of one. It doesn't mean everybody, even in a particular society, is necessarily doing everything culturally the same. There are lots of what we might call subcultures, for example, in a place like the US. So not everybody loves football, right? Which is illustrated in this slide. But the idea of culture is that it's something shared, right? So it's something that's passed among people, both across generations, as we've been talking about, right? So from grandparents to parents to children, but also, laterally, so amongst peer groups, right? And others, right? So any of those social spaces where you engage with other people and establish ways of doing things, share ideas, etc., those are examples of engaging in the shared quality of culture. Culture is also constantly changing, right? So this, again, sort of leads back to what I started with, that you are both the bearer and the creator of culture. So culture does not stay the same over time, even as there is some kind of continuity across generations. Ways of doing things, ways of thinking about, different institutions, something like marriage, for example, what it means to be a married couple, who can or should marry. These are all the kinds of things that we see changing right before our eyes. So culture is something that ties us together over time, but it's also something constantly in flux, constantly changing. Culture also includes universals. What I mean by this is that we can see that even as we look cross-culturally, right, across very different societies, there are certain things that everybody does, or at least most people do. And for example, this slide is a picture of a family, right? This happens to be a family composed of a man and his several wives and their children, right? So marriage is an example of what we might call a cultural universal, in the sense that pretty much all societies have some version of marriage. I will say that one of the things I'm having you read later this semester is an example of a society where people do not marry, just to sort of push against that idea that it's universal. But that's fairly rare, right? So marriage is an institution that we find quite consistently across societies, right? So there is, again, something sort of similar. There's something shared about how, just as people, as humans, we think about the world and we do things. But then that said, of course, the ways that people marry and how people think about what a marriage is are radically different, right? Both in terms of number of partners involved and all kinds of other things, okay? So there is something universal, and then it becomes quite fascinating for a cultural anthropologist to look at an institution that we see pretty much everywhere, right? So there's something in common there, but then to look at, well, how does it vary? Again, over time and across space. Culture is also integrated. What I mean by this is that although for the sake of studying it, we do tend to divide culture up into categories. I mean, even in a course like this, for example, we're going to spend sort of one unit talking about the economy, one unit talking about politics, one unit talking about health, one unit talking about art. One of the things we need to keep in mind, though, is that that can be useful as a device for studying something and understanding something. But in practice, all those different aspects of culture and of human social life are all mixed together. They're all integrated, right? The image I put on the slide, which is a poster created by an artist named Shepard Fairey, I put it up because I thought it's as equally a good example of politics and of art, right? It would be hard to figure out which category to put it in. And I think that's an example that's a broader characteristic of culture. All those different aspects are integrated in our daily lives. We don't, say, well, on Monday I'll, be economic. On Tuesday I'll be political. On Wednesday I'll be artistic. All of those elements of our lives and of our worldviews are intertwined. So culture is integrated. Culture is also symbolic. Probably the best example of the way in which culture is symbolic is our use of language. Language is a symbolic system, right? The exact way that language works is that we assign a particular sound, with a certain meaning. It's a somewhat arbitrary connection, right? The sound for that concept in one language is different than the sound in another language, right? So a symbol is something that stands for something else. It's basically a unit of meaning that can carry information. So language is a really good example of the ways that humans act in a symbolic way, but there are lots of others as well. So the image I have on the slide is of people making use of U.S. flags, right? A flag is absolutely a symbol. It carries with it all kinds of meanings about nationalism, about the sort of identity or status of a country. It can also be used in contrary ways, right? As a sign of protest, etc. So a fundamental characteristic of culture is that humans act symbolically. And we'll see a lot of this, particularly when we start talking about the anthropology of religion, right? Where there's lots of symbols being deployed. Culture also creates categories. This is sort of a fundamental aspect of what culture does. What people do with culture is to organize things into categories, for better and for worse. So the image I put on the slide here is of the census form. This is the last census form. And the part of the census that I'm representing here are the questions about race and ethnicity. Since the beginning of the census in the 19th century, there have always been questions about race and ethnicity, although they've always been slightly different each time the census comes out. You may know that the census is deployed every 10 years. So every 10 years we have, and we can look back historically at what these forms look like, which is kind of interesting to see, those categories change over time. So one of the things we might take from this is that there's always been this impulse to categorize people, right? To put people into groups. But the nature of those groups changes historically. And those categories can be used as weapons, as well as they can be used as ways to organize and to claim resources, for example. The categories are not necessarily bad or good, but the point here is that culture and people as enculturated beings tend to create and make use of categories, categorizing both elements of the world and other people. So again, culture creates categories. Culture is also used creatively. I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that culture is always in flux. And one of the reasons that it's always in flux or always sort of changing over time is that people are creative about their use of it. The slide is a picture of people engaging in a sort of artistic form called capoeira, which is particularly found in Brazil. And it's an art form that's sort of a combination of dance and martial arts. It reflects both history and culture. And it's one of those examples of how people sort of creatively engage with what they've experienced and, turn one thing into something else, right? So that creative use of what we experience to sort of fashion new cultural forms that can both hearken to the past and be something brand new, again, is a key characteristic of culture. Culture is also partly unconscious, which means that all these things I'm talking about, we do them without necessarily really thinking about it. Indeed, a lot of the stuff that we do that is a part of a particular cultural worldview, we do in a way that seems to us to be natural or feels like it's just the way things are done, right? We don't sort of, get out the rule book and figure out, where we're supposed to stand or what we're supposed to say. It's just sort of what comes out because we are steeped in that cultural world. It's just what happens almost as a matter of course. So again, one of the things, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, that cultural anthropologists try to do is to make the familiar strange. So if we start really looking at this stuff and understanding that it's not just quote unquote natural, it's not just quote unquote how people do stuff, but it's a specific cultural practice, then we can start to notice that some of the things that we do without thinking about it actually say something about who we are culturally, right? A really good example of this is what you do when you greet someone. We do that kind of action so much, and it's so sort of embedded in culture that we don't really have to think about it very much, right? But it's very specific and it's culturally variable. If you've ever traveled somewhere else, you may have noticed that some of those really basic things feel super different, right? For example, how somebody greets you. Do they grab you by the hand? Do they kiss you? Do they hug you? When you speak with someone that you've just met, do they stand right up close to you or do they stand a little bit further away? All of those things are these sort of partly unconscious elements of culture. We often can't kind of say why, but if somebody stands closer or farther away from us than we're used to, it can feel kind of uncomfortable. And it's a little just hard to figure out exactly what's going on. There's just something that feels different, right? You don't necessarily, think about it, but you can feel that. That's the sort of partly unconscious, embedded nature of all those cultural practices that you're used to. Okay, so those that list of qualities that I've just gone through, those are all things I'd like you to know about sort of culture as a concept and as an idea that we will work with as a part of the way that cultural anthropologists do their research. So, bear that in mind. Again, the cultural concept will continue to sort of emerge over the course of the semester, but I wanted to give you sort of that overview now. I'm going to add something now to a couple of other key concepts as a way of sort of ending out our first lecture. And these are related to the culture concept that I've just been discussing, but are a little bit different. So the first is the concept of cultural relativism. This is a very important idea for cultural anthropology. And what cultural relativism says is that in order to understand a cultural practice that is different than what we are used to, we need to first suspend our own cultural assumptions, our own cultural framework, in order to understand that culture from an insider's point of view, right? So if we want to understand something cross-culturally, we need to try to understand that culture in its own terms, not in our own terms, right? So in other words, you need to start by setting aside your own assumptions, prejudices, ideas about how the world is, if you want to fully understand an alternative perspective on how the world is. So that's cultural relativism. Now, I want to make a distinction now between cultural relativism and two other concepts. So the first is the comparison of cultural relativism versus ethnocentrism. These are basically opposites, right? So ethnocentrism is the idea of putting your own cultural framework in the center, right? So if you think about how that word is crafted, you can sort of get a sense of its meaning. So in other words, if you assume that the way you do things, the way you think about things, is not only just one variation, but it's the best way, it's the only way, it's the most natural way, that is acting in an ethnocentric way, okay? So what we try to do in the field of cultural anthropology is to get away from acting in that ethnocentric way and instead embrace an approach of cultural relativism. So we try to eschew or reject ethnocentrism and embrace cultural relativism, all right? The second comparison I want to make is between cultural relativism and moral relativism. People sometimes get the idea that cultural relativism, right, saying that we want to understand cultural practices or cultural ideas in their own terms from the perspective of people in that culture, somehow means that we're arguing that, you know, everything's okay, that people can do anything if it's in accordance with their culture and it needs to be accepted, right? And that's really not the case. Cultural anthropologists make a distinction between cultural relativism and moral relativism. So while cultural anthropologists embrace cultural relativism, we do not embrace moral relativism, all right? So in other words, the idea that in order to understand a cultural practice, we need to understand it in its own terms does not mean that we then need to condone it. For example, we might very well feel like a particular cultural practice is contrary to our own sort of moral compass or how we think about what is good for people. If you embrace the idea of a universal human rights, for example, that people are entitled to health, to well-being, to freedom from suffering, which I think many of us do, then you might very well think that certain things that are culturally condoned in some places are contrary to that, right? There's all kinds of things that happen in the United States that we might think are morally really problematic, even if they make sense culturally in this place, right? So what I'm saying here is that cultural anthropologists can and do embrace cultural relativism without being moral relativists. You can believe in certain moral principles across the boards and still be a relativist in terms of how you go about trying to understand cultural variability, okay? So I know I've thrown a lot of ideas at you today. Again, I think we'll spend a lot more time sort of unpacking all of these elements, but I'm hopeful that this set of tools that I presented in this first lecture will give you at least sort of a starting place for understanding what cultural anthropology is, and some means to continue to work on these things over time. So take care, and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.